pieces. So we're starting with nutrition. Is this food good and necessary for the human body? Does it provide nutrients difficult or impossible to get from plants? And at the same time, is meat harmful? Or is there a dose at which meat is harmful? And what does the science say? During these sessions, we're not going to be taking questions. The questions are going to be reserved for the workshops at the end of all the sessions. And so right now, I'm going to introduce the very first speaker, Neil Mann, Professor of Food Science and Human Nutrition at the University of Melbourne, who will be presenting on the evolutionary role of meat and its implications for contemporary nutrition and health challenges.
Thanks very much, Diana. And thank you for the invitation from the organising committee. If I just quickly work out how the buttons work. Yes, here. I'll change slides. Okay, thanks very much. I'm a nutritionist. I've been doing nutrition research for 40 odd years now. One of the areas in nutrition research I've been heavily involved in for much of that time is anthropology of nutrition, understanding what hunter-gatherers eat, and that started with work on Australian Aboriginals back in the early 1980s, but also looking at the actually early hominids and hominins and what they ate from their fossil records. And we're not going to change slides. It's not working here. Technology is a wonderful thing, isn't it? When it works. Okay, one of the things I did a few years ago is worked with colleagues from Oxford University School of Anthropology, and we actually wrote a textbook on this topic, which is available. So go out and buy it. I think I make about €50 out of each one sold. But it covers all this area. It's a highly referenced textbook for students studying anthropology of human diet. And yeah, we're still not going to. It worked. I've also worked on a number of studies, both on hunter-gatherers, contemporary hunter-gatherers, studying what they eat, but also looking at fossil remains of early hominids and hominins and predicting what they ate, measuring what they ate actually with hunter-gatherers, and published a number of papers over the years with various colleagues from around the world. I want to start with this slide here. It's a very crude, not to scale slide of human evolution in geological times. And what I'm trying to show here is that orange line is our line. It doesn't mean we're the most important species around, but it shows where we've come from, and it shows what other species have branched off, or we've branched off from them over time. The orangutans, gorillas, and I'm not having much success. Orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees are there. But look, the really critical point in time happened in the Pliocene, because at that point in time in Africa, and this is all happening in Africa, and I hate to tell everyone if you're unhappy about it, but we're all Africans, they had some global climate change, not as rapid as we're seeing now, but something occurred over several thousands of years. And what happens is the jungle shrank. And many of the creatures in the jungles, the various primates, stayed there in what was left, but some ventured out into grassland savannas, and they became us and a few of our cousins. And that's when our diet really changed, because before that, we were pretty much a frugivorous animal. A frugivorous animal is a herbivore that eats high quality plant foods, fruits and flowers and new shoots off plants and so on, much like the primates in jungles still do. But going out into the open grasslands, that food supply wasn't there anymore. We had to change. We had to find something different, or we weren't going to survive. And that's when we started to become more highly dependent on animal foods in our diet. And particularly for quite a while, for a couple of million years at least, it was scavenging because we didn't have a very big brain, we weren't good hunters and so on. And then eventually we become more intelligent, bigger brain, we become hunters and so on. About 60 to 80,000 years ago, we had the out of Africa experience where we left Africa and spread around the world. And about 10,000 years ago, we had the development of agriculture in a few different locations around the world. Those lines are not to scale. They should be much closer to the end, but PowerPoint wouldn't let me do it. Oh, goodness me. We are having trouble with this system. No, can't get the slides to readily change. Try that one. Okay, that might work. This is just an indication here to show you what some of our primate relatives still eat in their jungle environment. So gorillas, very low quality plant food in shoots and roots and leaves. That's a bonobo up there in the top right corner, eating flowers and so on. Chimpanzees eating wild fruits, something that probably give us bad diarrhea today. And something that most people don't realize, even chimps eat meat. They eat eggs, they eat grubs, they eat insects, and they eat small mammals that they catch as well. And basically, that's where we come from. This is an artist's rendition of us about 4 million years ago. Australopithecus apparensis. These are basically the first upright bipedal creatures, and they're out in semi-forested grassland areas. If you look around, there's not much food to eat there. There's an absolute mass of carbohydrate there to consume, but it's all cellulose, leaves and grass. We never did have, well, not certainly in a range of millions of years, the ability to digest that cellulose. So that carbohydrate wasn't available to us. What was available initially was the remains of herbivore kills, where large carnivore animals left bones and skulls and so on. We have lots of archaeological evidence of this, where we find rock marks, where they used basically stone tools to crack open bones and skulls, which large carnivores couldn't crack open. And inside those large bones, you've got bone marrow. Bone marrow, mostly fat, high energy. Inside the skulls, brain, mostly fat, high energy. So this was what these people lived on for quite a long time. So there's lots of archaeological evidence out there. The early hominids, these are our ancestors, bipedal ancestors called hominids. They scavenged for about 2 million years, and then they developed gradually hunting techniques for the next 2 million years. And there's quite a lot of evidence about that. So part of the problem in living out in those grassland environments is you had to find food regularly. It wasn't just like climbing a tree and picking something anymore. You kept having to find food, and the food you found and ate had to have a greater energy return than the energy you spent finding it. It's called optimal foraging theory. If you use something as a staple that took you a lot of energy to obtain and you didn't get much energy from it, well, your tribe died out pretty quickly. This is from a study from some South American Indians, a number of colleagues of mine did a few years ago, where they actually followed the Indians around. They measured what they ate, and they calculated the energy they got from eating those things versus what they spent gathering them. And they calculated in what's called return rate per kilocalories per hour. And virtually, what was it, 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 of the top foods that they ate were animal foods that gave them the best return. They ate plant foods. All our ancestors ate plant foods. They had bucket loads of plant foods. But the point was, it wasn't giving them very much energy. They had to get the animal foods to actually provide the energy. So do we know all this? Well, yes, we do. There are literally hundreds of laboratories of biophysicists and paleobiologists all around the world working in this area. Thousands of top-level, highly trained scientists that they do many different types of research to actually establish all this data. And if you go looking in anthropology journals, you will literally find thousands of papers dating back 40, 50 years. They look at things like craniodental features, the shape of teeth and jaws, etc., and the changes that happen, relate that to diet. There's a lot of work done on stable and radioisotope content of teeth and bone remains. And those tell us a lot of things about what these people were eating. The carbon-13-12 ratio, for instance, indicates whether they're eating mostly broadleaf plants or grasses, because the two different plant groups use different photosynthetic pathways, and they accumulate the carbon-13, carbon-12 isotopes at a different rate. The strontium-calcium ratio is a very common one that's measured, and it indicates the relative proportion of animal to plant food that's consumed in the diet. And even going back at South American data that was done by Sillen and so on, back in the 80s and 90s, even 2 million years ago, the ancestors of ours, hominids, had a strontium calcium ratio, somewhere like a hyena. So they were pretty much carnivorous or highly carnivorous by that stage. But once again, remember, they kept eating lots of plant foods. Just the plant foods didn't give them much of the energy. Lots of micronutrients, but not the energy. We have lots of studies looking at hunted game remains, the tools, the weapons, and so on that were used. Forensic paleobiology, where they look at teeth microwear patterns under the scanning electron microscope, and that tells you a lot about what was being eaten. There's the mathematical side of anthropology called optimal foraging theory, where it's all mathematical modeling of what could be eaten at the time, what was available, and what would give you survival and what wouldn't, and studies on gut morphology, what the insides of our intestines actually look like and what they were doing. How did I get involved in this sort of stuff? Well, back in the early 80s, I was like most trained nutritionists, dietitians around the world. I'd been trained in that very unscientific, almost Orwellian mantra, plant good, animal bad. And that's all we thought. Until my PhD supervisor back then, Professor Kieran O'Day, is probably the most famous nutritionist in Australia. She did studies on Aboriginals where she followed them around with a refrigerated truck, keeping samples of everything they ate, taking blood samples from them every day, doing anthropometric measurements every day. And what we found was these very unhealthy Aboriginal people were living on settlements, white settlements, eating very bad food. They went walkabout. Means they picked up their spears and boomerangs and threw off their clothes, and they literally went out into the desert for months at a time. And what she found was they were eating mostly animal food, because that's what's mostly available. In fact, 64% of the energy was animal food. And what did she observe? They lost weight, their blood glucose levels fell, their cholesterol levels fell, their blood pressures fell. Everything improved, and yet they're eating absolutely huge amounts of meat. And that sort of made us start to think, well, what the heck is going on here? This is not what we're trained to believe. Later on, I got together with a number of research professors around the world interested in diet and anthropology of diet. And we actually collected data that's already in existence from 181 contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. We looked at that data over about 5 years and analysed it, and we come up with a subsistence pattern of 65% energy from animal and 35% from plant. Quite the opposite of what you actually read about in unreferenced books. There was no such thing as a complete vegetarian society. So when people tell you that humans are vegetarians and were, we couldn't find any society that were. The Eskimos and the Kulin Kalahari Bushmen, and that exclamation mark there is real, they talk the click language. They're the extremes. Eskimos are almost 100% carnivore. Eskimos, Aleuts, Athabascan Indians, anyone who lives in that northern area, Canada, Alaska, and so on. The Kulin Kalahari Bushmen, even though they have their bows and arrows and hunt some game, they have this incredible plant in Kalahari called the mongongo tree, which grows mongongo nuts. And it is available most of the year round, which is very rare for a plant. Many nuts and fruits are only very, very limited in the time you can actually pick them. And this particular plant's high in protein, fat, and carbohydrate. It's quite unique. So basically, they're very lazy people. They sit under the tree and wait for the stuff to fall, and they eat it. And occasionally they'll go and hunt something with their bows and arrows. If anyone's ever seen that movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy, absolutely incredible. That's all about these people in a very humorous way. See it sometime if you can. It's quite amusing. In every case of those 181 societies, the pattern of food procurement followed mathematically perfectly optimal foraging theory. They concentrated on the things that gave them the most energy return. In fact, when we map it out like this and look at the subsistence pattern on animal foods, there's no group down at the bottom in with zero dependence on animals. So there's no vegetarian societies. That one group in yellow are the Kalahari Bushmen. The two in the red, one was the Hasda of Africa, and I forget what the other one was. But you'll see that the median is up around 65% energy from animal foods. And those 9 groups at the far end, as I said, they're very northern latitude people where there's not a lot of plant food to be had anyway. What about the GI tract? So this 4 million years of animal food, did it affect our digestive system? Well, you bet it did. And the main effect was to increase our potential to digest animal foods. And this involved a lot of biochemical and physiological changes. In 25 minutes, I can't even touch on it. I spend a whole semester talking about this stuff. But I'll give you a couple of key points. The GI tract in humans actually condensed and becomes smaller and simpler. And it can only do that if you have to do less processing of the food to digest it. And the only way to do that, when you shift from something like what gorillas and chimpanzees were eating, was to shift to something that was more fat and protein dominated, which actually is more easily digested. Okay. Here's something that staggers all the vegans who come to my talk. They don't like this at all because they'll tell you we're a herbivorous animal. If you want to be a herbivorous animal, you've got to either be a ruminant, or you've got to have a coecum. You've got to be a foregut folivore or a midgut folivore. You've got to have a fermentation chamber to break down cellulose. Now, if you look at humans, we have a tiny little residual coecum there that probably disappeared in terms of functionality 10, 15, 20 million years ago. So we haven't been able to do this for quite a while. Even our primate friends in the jungles don't have very big coecums. That structure you see there is almost the same as most carnivores, though we have a greater propensity to use plant food than most carnivores. Yeah, there is argument that we maybe obligate carnivores, but I don't believe that. We're very good at being omnivores. We can even look at measurements of how you compare gut structures just through simple mathematics. If you look at things like the intestinal length to body length ratio, it's often used in anthropology, or GI surface area to body surface area. You compare two animals like a cattle and a horse, a ruminant and a midgut folivore, and you see a herbivore pattern. You look at a human and we're more like a dog pattern. Even when you compare us to our close primate relatives in the jungles, we're different. We have moved away from what they are. You can see at the end here under colon, look at the volume of our colon, our large intestine compared to them. They use their colon as a substitute for fermentation chamber. They have a small residual coecum that they can use. We have no functional coecum. We have most of the volume of the digestive tract actually in the small intestine, more like a carnivore. So the gut size got smaller. Diet quality had to increase. The only way that can happen, higher, more density food, more easily digested, and that spells animal food. And there's a number of papers on this. Something happened to the brain when all this was going on. Many people would tell you the human brain started to get bigger when we started to cook food and release food energy with fire. Well, they're partly right, but they're about 2.5 million years out of sync with reality. The brain size actually started increasing about 4 million years ago, as soon as we started to get out into those savanna lands. And it did increase a bit more after we developed fire, but the process was well underway. Now, you can't increase brain size without a change in energy metabolism. Your basal metabolic rate has to go up because the brain, believe it or not, you probably don't believe it with some people, but uses a heck of a lot of energy in processing things. And what we find is our brain size got bigger, in fact, about 4.6 times bigger, according to the Martin equation, than it should be for a mammal our size. But our metabolic rate didn't change. And the only other thing that can happen is another organ system has to get smaller and require less energy to keep your BMR at the same rate it was. And that happened. In this seminal paper by two very famous anthropologists, Ayla and Wheeler, called the expensive tissue hypothesis, they actually calculated the energy use and the size of brains and intestines and different organs in the body. And they found that the brain was bigger than it should be. The intestine was smaller than it should be. And the metabolic increment of increase in brain energy was perfectly matched by the decrease in the GI tract energy use. And that's called the expensive tissue hypothesis, or the brain-gut trade-off. I want to now touch on a few nutritional things to do with diet. And I haven't got time to go into all of the things possible, and some of the other speakers will. Much of what I've done over the years is looked at brain function in terms of meat nutrition. And this is where it's most important. Brain function really depends on meat in the human diet. And there's a number of specific things in meat that you don't get from plants, or you don't get very well from plants. First of all, your balanced intake of amino acids. Okay, some people will tell you if you eat soy, you'll get that. Yes, close. Or you eat a balance of other plants, you might. In meat, you get it straight away. Iron and zinc, we all know they're much better absorbed when they're protein bound, much better absorbed. Vitamin B12 is only from animals, not from plants. No matter what some of the websites will tell you, there's no B12 in plants. And the omega-3 fatty acid content, particularly EPA, DHA, only come from animals, not from plants. So if you're relying on plants to get these things, you're not going to get them. How are we done? Fine. I'll say a couple of things about B12. There's no B12 in plant food, not even B12 in mushrooms, and you get told that all the time. There can be, if you don't wash your mushrooms and you grow them in manure, you've got it on the surface. The B12 comes from bacteria. You'll get the B12 with dirty mushrooms, but you get a bad case of the runs as well with it. We make it. Animals make B12 by bacteria in our colon. Unfortunately, it's too far down for us to absorb, so we lose all what we eat. So we have to get it from animals. The other thing is, if you don't have enough B12 in your system, you suffer a whole lot of very nasty diseases, some of which can end up being fatal. And you also build up a substance in your body called homocysteine. And this homocysteine requires B12 to break it down. And we now know that the double whammy of low B12 and high homocysteine is a very big impact on brain function. A number of years ago, we did a study and we looked at high meat eaters, vegetarians, vegans, and we looked at their B12 status. And you can see there on the bottom, the lowest B12 was in the vegans. Many of those vegans we had to send off for B12 injections with their doctors. The higher meat eaters had the highest level of B12. Doesn't mean these high meat eaters were the healthiest people, by the way, because they generally were overweight and they were high everything eaters. But we were just concerned about their B12 intake. And then we looked at their homocysteine levels, and we found the higher the homocysteine, the lower the higher the B12, the lower the homocysteine. In vegans, we found the highest levels of homocysteine. So what happens with B12? You have lack of B12, you've got neurological complications, cognitive impairment, brain atrophy. Brain atrophy is shrinking of the brain and developing holes in it. There's a lot of research now with brain scanning showing this is happening. I've put here just a few papers that I pulled off the internet very quickly. Any of you who are not scientists and you want to check anything, go to PubMed or Medline, which is where you can get all the various medical papers, put in a few keywords. I did it and I come up with a couple of thousand papers, which I just picked a couple of off the top of my head there. And that shows you what happens with B12. Iron and zinc are the same. What have I got? A couple of minutes?
2 minutes.
That same study we did years ago, we looked at the various meat-eating groups or non-meat-eating groups, and we found the highest status for iron, and we got the same for zinc, was in the meat-eating groups. The vegetarian groups were very low. In fact, many of the vegetarian vegan groups were actually, or many of the people in them, were below deficiency levels. So they had iron deficiency anemia. And they ate more iron than the meat eaters. So when we did the dietary analysis, they were eating more iron because they were eating lots of grain foods and so on that contained iron, but they weren't absorbing it. And this just shows you how much difference there is in absorbing iron from animal foods versus plant foods. Some of the plant foods can be quite high, but the bioavailability is very low. So what happens with iron status in the brain? Decreased processing speed and accuracy, poor cognitive performance, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many things that go wrong in the brain with low iron and low zinc. And once again, I pulled off a smattering of papers, which I could have put a couple of thousand there that show you. Unfortunately, many people don't even look at these. They ignore them totally. Zinc, same sort of thing. Zinc has all sorts of structural effects on the brain as well as functional effects. And zinc supplementation in low zinc people actually starts to reverse those things. Particularly studies I've seen in depression in women. Many of them are zinc deficient. And same here, zinc is in some plant foods, but it's very poorly absorbed. You can see the difference in absorption rate between beef and bran flakes, for instance, where the content of zinc is probably the same, but the absorption is different. Once again, I pulled up quickly just a few papers to show you that, so hopefully you can all get a copy of those. Now, one thing I want to finish on, just before Diana throws me off the stage, is a number of studies we did following our Aboriginal work was we wanted to see within normal Caucasian population if eating a lot of meat had an effect on cholesterol, because everyone told you eating meat will raise your cholesterol. Well, we put people on 500 grams of meat a day. 500 grams of meat a day is a big slab. After 3 weeks, you never wanted to see meat again in your life. I was a patient or subject on one of these studies and an analyst on several. But our cholesterol levels went down on eating lean meat. But it's not rocket science. The things that make your cholesterol go up are not in lean meat. They might be in the meat fat, and they might be in palm oil. There's specific fatty acids that do this, but they're not in the lean meat, not to any great extent. So even though there's cholesterol in the meat, the cholesterol in the meat doesn't raise your blood cholesterol. In fact, there's a negative feedback effect on your liver production of cholesterol. So just to finish, do animal source foods contain cholesterol? Yes, they do. Can high meat intake give you a high cholesterol intake? Yes, it does. But does it raise your blood level? No, it doesn't. You can actually lower your blood level of cholesterol while you're eating lean meat, as long as you lower the saturated fat in the diet. The last one I wanted to look at, recent research has shown that there's a triple whammy effect on brain function. Low, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA, only from animals and fish. Low B12 and high homocysteine. If you've got those three things together, you're almost certainly going to end up with dementia or some form of Alzheimer's and brain atrophy. A number of these studies are coming out right now. I think I'll leave it at that. Sorry if I went over.